see whether it does add up. Is it not imperative that we use history to reframe this rebirth and draw some lessons from it? First, it is not as a result of an organically evolving process that the African is fully in charge of, even if, independently, there are some salient homegrown features that are propelling it, and that ultimately inspire hope that we can take control of this process and really, really, truly make it benefit our people. A key driver of this optimism is China's emergence as a heavy hitter on the global arena at a time when Western capital is hungry for new markets that will guarantee it the growth it is used to. Simply put, China, and to a lesser extent India, want Africa's oil, minerals, and land to sustain their own growth into the future. The China-Africa trade passed the $1 billion level in 1980 and jumped to $10 billion 20 years later, as China, of course, experienced the unprecedented growth of averaging 9% GDP over those decades. The second key trend, in my view, is the big consumer product multinationals, ranging from PepsiCo to General Electric, Samsungs and LGs and others, which are now pitching camp here in the knowledge that, yes, this is where the future consumers will reside in increasing numbers. Africa is one of the few markets that can assure any investor double-digit returns on their investments. This is thanks to the significant investments that have been made over the years in education and health. Equally, Africa's diaspora is coming back. The African woman is getting emancipated by the day and having a dramatic impact on the consumer space. Then there is the issue that Edu has mentioned here, the telecommunication technology that has found in Africa a ready and willing partner to experiment with. The money transfer services and creative uses that communication technology is being used for, in education, in health, in opening up of markets, are all pointing at very, very exciting opportunities. Then there is the endearing story of the increasing number of African capitalists that can put together large amounts of capital to invest in the continent. There is even an African Forbes magazine confirming that the dollar billionaire African entrepreneurs are finally here, and they're growing in numbers by the day. This is all fantastic news, but it's only one side of the story. It needs to be nuanced. The media must continue focusing on the ugly face of the continent. For 50 years, the media has not sufficiently been angry about the squalor and deplorable state of the vast areas of this continent. When leaders choose to break promises from election to election, watch as its people are brutalized by draconian regimes, when corruption is encouraged by the leaders, the media have been lukewarm in demanding accountability. They have also not done a very good job of explaining the interconnections between poor governance and the squalor and poverty that condemns hundreds of millions of Africans to no life. To be fair, most media have not had a very rosy time either. Small-sized media businesses have been particularly vulnerable and were often threatened with closure or more dire consequences, forcing them to become timid. It was easier to turn away from the reality of impunity and largely entertain the masses. Media that voiced resistance paid a high price. But just like Africa is poised on a major opportunity, so does the media. They must redefine their role and emphasize more on their capacity to educate, to persuade, and to energize people. They must learn that most times uneducated, empowered people will force change more quickly than a merely critical media. People vote and pay taxes. And in rethinking their roles, media must embrace technology as a tool, that they need to deploy. Through social media tools, media can vastly enlarge their pool of reporters, although they also must be judicious about how to verify the information before they put it out, because there's always an underside to all this. They will need to rethink their newsrooms and business models as they realign themselves to satisfy the new consumer who has at his or her disposal numerous other sources of accessing news. To enhance their relevance, I suggest that Africa's media address some of the following areas. With what editors call day one news becoming the domain of the instant messaging and social media world, media must enhance their capacity to report deeply and extensively. They have the advantage of resources that can sustain researched and more thorough investigated reporting than have the bloggers and the tweeters and the people who use Facebook to communicate. While remaining vigilant as watchdogs for the masses, media must equally sharpen their capacity to educate and explain the reality of the continent. Specifically, our African media must address the issues of managing natural resources, security, poverty and equity, governance, and the environment. How to equitably share the largesse from the ground, oil, minerals, gas, and water, has been a thorny and often deadly issue, as we know from Nigeria, the Sudans, the unease over the use of the Nile waters. Kenya, Uganda now have oil. They've joined the list of cursed countries, if the experience of others is anything to go by, and have announced that they will have oil. What will that oil bring to these two nations? Will media help? It has to. But to do that, they must grasp the complexities that surround the realities in these sectors. They must, in order to empower the people, to know how to frame their demands in a manner that does not turn counterproductive. Already, in parts of Kenya at least, the people living in areas where this oil has been discovered are hearing that large swaths of their land has been sold to these fellows who are prospecting, and they haven't even been told how that helps them. The media needs to intervene. Security is a major issue, with Africa now becoming the stage for proxy wars against real and imagined enemies of global interest, especially the US. The fight against terrorism is one subject that can very easily drive a wedge between already nervous neighbors, and the media have a duty to educate, understand it, and educate its readers, its viewers, its listeners on exactly what's going on. Closely related to this is the need for media to report with knowledge and sensitivity on religious issues. Environment is an exceedingly important subject that has been inadequately reported. How Africa fits into the contentious high-stakes global debate about who should bear responsibility for the threatened environment is critical. Africa so far appears to be a bystander in this discourse. But most urgent, perhaps, is the need to explain Africa's potential rebirth for what it is, an externally driven process taking advantage of internal dynamics and realities. Media must be at the forefront of welcoming it, but be quick to caution that when China invites all of Africa's leaders to Beijing and signs away hundreds of billions of dollars in aid and loans, what have our leaders left behind? You can be sure it is not free money. Don't forget that with the tons of infrastructural cash is also a very ambitious plan to open hundreds of cultural centers and bureau offices for China's official media across the world. And how are the threatened Western powers likely to respond? Is this another Cold War in the making? Are they likely to ease pressure on African governments to be accountable so that they carry favor and become a throwback to the Cold Wars of the 80s and 70s. How should and can Africa be hurt in this process? How can it benefit? Media must constantly review the contracts and deals being entered into, evaluate the bidders, and ensure that contracts that do not leave a significant residual value in the country in which those projects are taking place are questioned. The media must learn how to be proactive. It has been reactive for too long. Like China and India before it, Africa is shedding its impoverished image and attracting attention as the new emerging market for trade and investment. Africa's existing resources are likely to be dwarfed by its future discoveries, which makes the work and the responsibility of the media even more onerous. The media must advocate for empowerment of the local private sector through regulatory mechanisms and provision of incentives that reduce exposure and enhance the possibility of success of investments. No private sector anywhere has ever survived without very proactive support of governments, and for the governments to leave private sector alone to their own devices is to be unrealistic. So only when most of the big local investments start gaining confidence that they can participate and they can be successful, that we can start feeling confident that we're finally taking charge of this rebirth, this moment of hope that we are all discussing. The media must continue to encourage ongoing political changes in a number of African countries as part of its contribution to building institutions of governance. The implementation of Kenya's widely acclaimed new constitution could, for instance, benefit from more media support, more unsustained media support, because there's plenty of mischief afoot to frustrate the implementation of that constitution. On governance, it should be mentioned that the majority of Africa's 54 states are to varying degrees democratic. Can argue about that. There have been slow but steady developments with regard to forms and shapes of how this governance evolves. The AU, for instance, has taken an explicit decision not to recognize countries in which civilian governments have been overthrown in coups. The African Peer Review Mechanism has, as its explicit rationale, the strengthening of democracies and the accountability mechanisms within it. We must continue supporting the implementation and evolving of these kinds of institutions to ensure that we do not go back, because this moment that we're discussing here ultimately will thrive only if there are institutions, whether it's judiciary, parliament, and others that ensure that there is a level playing ground for everybody involved in the process. So what are we saying? The central proposal of our remarks this morning is that yes, Africa is changing profoundly and now stands at the door of another great opportunity to transform itself into the giant it should be, and that the transformation needs to be spearheaded from within the continent to ensure that the people benefit for the longer term. This calls for a sea change in the way every level of leadership has been thinking and acting. The media, being the media, have an even more critical role of playing the mind shapers, the educators, and the motivators. This will require that they retool themselves and review their business models and approaches. It cannot be business as usual as they are running out of excuses. There are success cases that exist in the continent to show that media can actually thrive into big businesses with the capacity to grow, on the one hand, the cloud to participate, to make a difference, and also to actually make money and go on. We know about the NAPSTAs in South Africa here, the Guardian Group, Algeria, just examples, and of course, the group that I work for, the Nation Media Group. Let it not be said 20 years from now that we wasted Africa's second chance. Thank you all, and I wish you wonderful and meaningful conversations for the next 3 days.